Okay guys, so this is the end of 10.3 and 10.4. Today, this is the very last of it. This is up to modern times, so the people we'll talk about as we get into today, some are still currently in power. So before we can get there, however, we need to talk about the fall of the Soviet Union. We're going to start with long-term causes and then talk about a short-term cause. So we've had the Soviet Union, which started in 1917, and it's going to go all the way to then about 1990. Long-term causes, remember the cost of protecting and maintaining its empire in Eastern Europe, all those little satellite nations that USSR has taken on is too high. There's call for reforms from the burgeoning middle class, which will become increasingly influential in the 1970s and 1980s. There's going to be a general economic crisis that we're going to be looking at in 10.4 here in just a little bit during the 1970s, largely spurred by an oil crisis that will lay the foundation for the collapse of communism in Eastern Europe in the late 1980s. Nationalist resentment of the Soviet government was going to grow among many of the Soviet republics, especially the Baltic republics of Latvia, Lithuania, and Estonia, which are going to eventually lead to the empire's downfall. Those nationalistic tendencies of I don't want to be ruled by another person, etc. So we'll see those coming into play here. Also, the economy is going to continue to lag since the 1960s. Although Gorbachev, remember with his perestroika policy, it had sought to reform the economy, as we've talked about already. Just one second, let me get my dog. So we saw that those had failed. Shortages of food are still going on, so Russian people getting more and increasingly frustrated. The 9-year war in Afghanistan that we've talked about was a financial, military, psychological, and resource drain on an already weakened USSR. And the Soviets are going to have to then retreat in Afghanistan in 1988 in the face of strong resistance. So those are all some of our long-term causes there. We're going to see that our short-term cause is going to be for the fall of the Soviet Union is a coup in Moscow in 1991. So those communist hardliners are frustrated by the loss of Soviet power and prestige after the revolutions of 1989, and they're going to attempt to overthrow Gorbachev. However, the coup is going to fail when the military refuses to crush popular resistance. So when all these little pockets of people start to pop up, they're going to fail at holding them down, and ultimately that is going to lead to the failure of these hardline communists. Boris Yeltsin is going to be the president of Russia from 1991 to 2000. He is going to defy the Soviet tanks at this time and become a national hero, which is what's going to also allow him to become the president in 1991 to 2000. And the coup will ultimately fatally weaken Gorbachev and spell doom for the Soviet Union, as we're going to see his removal. So Yeltsin and his liberal allies are going to declare Russia independent and withdraw from the Soviet Union, and all other republics are going to follow. So on December 25th, Christmas of 1991, the Soviet Union will dissolve into 15 separate republics, and these republics are going to remain economically connected for a few years via the Commonwealth of Independent States, or the CIS. And so that's if you think about if the United States were to dissolve, we would, just all these separate little entities right away. We would be still held together by, some economic needs. And so we'll see that that's the Commonwealth of Independent States in Russia here. Russia is going to assume the Soviet Union's seat in the United Nations Security Council at this time. And so we need to talk about how this transition takes place, or what are the post-1991 challenges in Central and Eastern Europe because of this declaration of Russian independence. And so here's a map really quickly, so you can see the area that Russia here pulling away, and then our other separate republics that are going to separate out here. That's why you hear about things like Kazakhstan and Uzbekistan and Turkmenistan. So a map of the Commonwealth of Independent States of December 25th, 1991. And so Russia, now under President Boris Yeltsin, is ultimately going to fail to significantly improve the Russian economy. There's going to be and reasons that the transition to a market economy is going to prove slow and painful. This is a hard transition, because for so long we have had that collectivism and that holding on by the government. The strategy of shock therapy advocated by the U.S. and IMF was not fully carried out by Yeltsin. That 1998 financial crisis that we talked about is going to result in the near collapse of the Russian banking system, and Russia is going to default on its foreign creditors, and its currency is going to collapse. We're going to see the GDP drop about 15%, unemployment increase from 5 to 13%, hyperinflation of 1992 to 94 was reduced a bit. We're also going to see that Russia is going to increasingly rely on its oil production, and some began to call it a petro-state, criticizing the government for not doing more to diversify the national economy, especially with the oil crisis that we spoke about. Political changes proved difficult. You can kind of see here that the Russian citizens are going to experience a crisis of identity. It's going to try too quickly to overhaul its political procedures, rights, and institutions, so they're not kind of doing everything too fast, and so having limited success. National government will struggle with the distribution of scarce resources, and some historians even contend that Yeltsin tried to do too, have you ever heard you can do one thing really well or do a bunch of things really poorly? That's kind of what he does. He jumps in full force with just too much rather than focusing on one thing. And he'll become embroiled in a power struggle with a conservative parliament. Parliament leaders holed up in the White House, the Parliament Tower in Moscow, are going to unleash a crowd to assault the Kremlin and the television center. And Yeltsin is going to send tanks against the White House, against the Parliament, and 120 people will be killed and top floors of the tower shelled and burned. And we haven't seen this much violence since the revolution of 1905 in Moscow. So big deal there. He's going against a very conservative parliament. And then we're going to see the war in Chechnya. It's one of the biggest issues of the 1990s and early 2000s. And it was the insurgency in the predominantly Muslim Russian Republic of Chechnya. In 1991, a group of Chechen nationalists are going to declare independence from Russia. And in return, Yeltsin will order a full-scale invasion in late 1994. And over 100,000 Chechen and 4,000 Russians are going to die by 1997 until a peace agreement is reached. A second war then will begin in 1999 when radical Islamists begin a campaign of terror and violence that continues through the mid-2000s. And on New Year's Day 2000, Yeltsin is going to have to resign due to poor health and a lack of popularity because of the war in Chechnya, because of his power struggle with the conservative parliament and the issue that happened in Moscow. And so this is where Vladimir Putin will become the president of Russia in 2000. So under Putin, we're going to see the process of beginning re-centralizing power by increasing the power of the already strong executive branch and weakening regional governments. Freedom of press will be severely restricted, so we're starting to see, that turn back. We've seen some liberties come. Now it's going to be taken away. And economic reforms were somewhat successful. The GDP growth will range from 5 to 10%. Unemployment will decrease to 8%. And Putin's role in stabilizing the Russian economy and his crackdown on Chechen rebels will result in his overwhelming re-election in 2004 with 71.3% of the vote. In 2008, after having termed out of office, Putin ran for prime minister and will serve as prime minister until 2012. Many will contend that Putin remained the most powerful leader in Russia despite the election of his handpicked successor, Dmitry Medvedev, to the presidency in 2008. Medvedev will continue Putin's policies while seeking to diversify Russia's economy, which is what Yeltsin should have done, and cracking down on corruption. But in 2012, Putin will begin his third term as president. So now we're talking about people that currently are still in power. That's how far we've come in history and all the craziness that's going on right now. But that's, for another lecture. Someday this will all be on the AP Euro exam. Yeltsin's foreign policy was aimed at gaining economic and political cooperation with the West, and as Russia's economy stabilized in the 2000s, Putin began distancing himself from the West, as we now know, and he became more reactionary in some of his policies, which we now know, and he grew concerned about former Eastern European bloc countries entering NATO, and he also opposed the United States' development of an anti-missile system that violated the 1972 ABM Treaty and opposed the U.S. invasion of Iraq in 2003. And so we're seeing all of this play out, like all of these policies that he took. While once early there was hopefulness because of his cooperation with the West, we can, definitely, this is an intriguing issue to be discussing, is what's going on in the world right now. But we need to shift back to Eastern Europe and what will be on the AP exam, and we'll need to talk about, also some problems. So there were some good things, but some problems that continue to plague Eastern Europe. So the shift to market economy will be difficult. No precedents existed to guide the transition, and legal, institutional, and cultural underpinnings were missing. Economic activity will decline by 1/3. Poland, however, will be our exception here. It will be the most successful by 1993. The GDP will grow over 4% and 5% in 1995, the fastest in Europe. Czechoslovakia will adopt the world's first mass privatization scheme. Hungary's economy will be the freest in Eastern Europe. It will change more slowly. And then by 1995, we're going to see Poland, Czechoslovakia, and Hungary are doing well enough to be taken seriously as potential European Union or EU members by the year 2000. And the EU is going to be something that we talk about in more detail here in 10.4 as we talk just really specifically about economy. But some of the continuing problems, as I said, were coming. Unemployment figures about 15% throughout most of the region. Inflation will remain dangerously high in some countries. Governments are going to run large deficits. In 1995, former communists will return to power in Bulgaria, Hungary, Lithuania, and Poland. But capitalism is going to remain an important aspect of Eastern European economies once it has made its way there. And then slowly we're going to start to see Eastern Europe, because of all of this, integrating into Europe as a whole. And so NATO is actually going to welcome former Eastern Bloc countries. And I think your notes say 1999, it should say 1997. The Czech Republic, Poland, and Hungary will be included in NATO. And then in 2004, Estonia, Latvia, Lithuania, Slovakia, Slovenia, Romania, and Bulgaria will be included. And then the European Union in 2004 will include the Czech Republic, Estonia, Hungary, Latvia, Lithuania, Poland, Slovakia, and Slovenia. And so remember, NATO had been, to protect against the USSR, but now there's not a USSR, so some of these Eastern Bloc countries then will be slowly integrated into Europe or into the European community, and that's going to bring us finally to nationalism since World War II, one of our mania causes of World War I and World War II. And so what we're going to see now is the concept of decolonization. So we grew into all of this war with imperialism and colonization, and now we're going to see after World War II that the European powers are going to experience the disintegration of their colonial empires after World War II. Between 1947 and 1962, almost every colonial territory gained independence. New nations of Asia and Africa are going to be deeply influenced by Western ideas and achievements. And so the causes of this decolonization are going to be rooted in nationalism. So modern nationalism and a belief in self-determination that we saw come out of World War I and World War II, and racial equality, is going to spread from intellectuals to the masses in virtually every colonial territory after World War I. The decline of European prestige that happened in these wars, Japanese victories in Asia over European colonial powers, inspired colonies to rise up against their European colonial masters. And destruction of Europe during World War II made the colonial powers vulnerable to these nationalistic sentiments in Asia and Africa. And after 1945, European powers were more concerned about rebuilding Europe, having to rebuild Europe. So their colonies are going to become not only less of a priority, but less manageable because of the attentions they're going to have to place at home. And so in regards to Asia, India is going to play a key role in decolonization and the decline of imperialism. Remember, they have been the jewel in Great Britain's crown. The Indian National Congress gave the British really no choice but to develop a native political elite that could assist in ruling such a huge country. Exposure of young Indians to Western ideas of nationalism, socialism, and democracy will lead to their demands for independence by the earliest 20th century. They are going to take these things that they are seeing and apply them then to their selves and demand their own independence. And so Mohandas Gandhi, 1869 to 1948, is going to lead the independence movement through the principle of passive resistance or civil disobedience. You probably went into much more depth than we're going to be able to go here because this is AP Euro, not AP Asian history, that on Gandhi, but really need to know that his relevance here to independence movements and their importance in India is going to inspire others with his policies of passive resistance, people such as Martin Luther King in the United States. And then a gentleman by the name of Jawaharlal Nehru is going to lead the Congress Party in its push for independence from 1889 to 1964. And the Prime Minister of Great Britain at this time, remember following Churchill's Clement Attlee, and he and others in the Labour Party in Great Britain are going to wish to focus on domestic British affairs rather than foreign British affairs. Lord Louis Mountbatten is going to be appointed to supervise the transition of India to independence. And so Great Britain really just realized they have more work to do at home than they need to be doing in their foreign policy. India will then be divided into two nations, India, which was predominantly Hindu, and Pakistan, which was predominantly Muslim, and gained their independence. And so next in Vietnam, after Japan was removed after World War II, the French are going to try to reassert their control of Indochina, including Vietnam, Laos, and Cambodia. However, Ho Chi Minh is going to lead the independence movement in the north. And in 1954, he will defeat French forces at Dien Bien Phu. In 1954, Vietnam will be divided into North Communist and South Pro-Western, which will result in a civil war. Of course, the United States is going to be put in a stance of, which side to take. Are we going to take the French side as we have been their ally, or are we going to, assert, that self-determination, where should we step in? We will step in but be eventually defeated in our attempt to prevent the communist takeover of South Vietnam. So our containment policy is not working here as well. And Vietnam will be unified in 1975 and free of Western influence. And so, Vietnam stirs up a lot of issues with the United States, and also this decolonization issue in the 1970s. Our next topic is number 4 here, Arab nationalism. And so we're going to talk about how Arab nationalists were loosely united by opposition to colonialism and the migration of Jews to Palestine, and an issue that is continuing to cause issues that we see here recently as well. And so in terms of Arab nationalism, we're going to see the Balfour Declaration in 1917 indicate that Britain favored a creation of a Jewish national home in Palestine, opposed, however, by Saudi Arabia and Transjordan. Great Britain is going to announce its withdrawal from Palestine in 1948, and the United Nations is going to vote for the creation of 2 states, one Arab and one Jewish, to be made out of Palestine. And then you remember, this is after the Holocaust, and wanting to give a home. Then we talked about the Jewish question and really wanting to make a homeland for Jews. Jerusalem then at this point is supposed to become an international city, and who's not going to be happy about this are going to be the Palestinians, and they boycott these proceedings, and they vow to fight on until Israel was destroyed or until they established their own independent Palestinian state. And this has led to several wars and numerous conflicts in the late 20th century because of this carving up of a Jewish national home. They're like, why don't you carve up some of Europe and give it to them? The Palestinians not happy with their having to give up something. And so we know all of the issues that belie from that today in the fighting over Jerusalem and the peoples that it put into an area and the conflicts that rose out of that. Continuing on with where the remainder of some of our Arabs are, we're going to move into Egypt. And so the Arab defeat in 1948 by Israel is going to trigger a successful nationalist revolution in Egypt in 1952 that will effectively end British control of Egypt. In 1956, Egyptian President Gamal Abdel Nasser nationalizes the Suez Canal, and that is the last vestige of European colonialism. It's the very last symbol and substance of Western power in the Middle East. France, Britain, and Israel are going to attack Egypt, trying to take back control of the Suez Canal. But our new now superpowers after World War II, the United States and the Soviet Union, are both going to demand that France, Britain, and Israel withdraw and that the canal remain in Egypt's control. And so we're going to see that France and Britain, which have once been able to do as they wished, are going to be told by the two new superpowers to leave the Suez Canal in Egypt's control. And that's going to lead us into Algeria in the mid-1950s and some other dealings with the French and what's left of their colonial empire. So Algeria's large French population considered Algeria an integral part of France and did not want the colony to become independent. And so a bitter civil war is going to break out between France and Algerian nationalists, those who say, no, we're Algerian, we should be ruled by our own, and those that are in Algeria who see themselves as French. Charles de Gaulle, who had returned to power as part of the movement to keep Algeria French, is going to accept the principle of Algerian self-determination. And in 1962, after more than a century of French rule, Algeria is going to become independent and the European population is going to quickly flee. This crisis is going to lead to all of the French Fourth Republic and beginning of the Fifth Republic in France. And then we're going to travel to sub-Saharan Africa. It is here that decolonization is going to proceed much more smoothly than it had in northern Africa, with the British Commonwealth of Nations beginning in 1957 with Ghana. Britain's colonies achieved independence with little or no bloodshed and will enter into a very loose association with Britain. The exception here, however, is the Mau Mau Society, were a Kenyan group of terrorists or freedom fighters who fought to the end English control of Kenya. And so remember, AP Euro always really likes the exception question, so the exception would be the Mau Mau Society. As a side note here, Obama's grandfather was fought in this uprising. He was Kenyan, and he was a Mau Mau fighter, and he will be captured and imprisoned and tortured by the British. So kind of always makes you wonder when the Queen and Obama are in the same room. I mean, is that dinner side conversation? I don't know. Those are all linking now very closely to us as we move forward. And then in 1958, we're going to see that President de Gaulle is going to offer leaders of French Black Africa a choice of a total break with France or immediate independence within a kind of French Commonwealth. And all but one of the new states chose association with France. And so cultural imperialism at this point is going to continue. France and common market partners saw themselves as continuing their civilizing mission in Black Africa, and they desired markets for industrial goods, raw materials, outlets for profitable investment, and good temporary jobs for their engineers and teachers. I'm going to skip through letter B here because we've just covered this, Eastern Europe and Russia during the Cold War, so you can read through that again. We've already talked about that in lecture, and then move down to the Civil War in Yugoslavia. If you remember that Yugoslavia is a hodgepodge of people with a lot of old grudges or existing grudges in the area, and a huge mix of different kinds of people, and that becomes a problem when you have nationalism, when you don't have, what is your identity? And the cause of this civil war is really going to be in 1990 when President Slobodan Milosevic is going to seek a Serbian-dominated Yugoslavia, so he's going to start to put Serbians ahead of the other nationalities in Yugoslavia by establishing tighter central control over previously autonomous regions. Milosevic is going to become president after Tito, if you remember Tito that we talked about, dies in 1980. So in response to the new president's determination that Serbians should be to dominate Yugoslavia, Croatia and Slovenia will declare independence, and each will fight Serbia successfully. Bosnia-Herzegovina will declare its independence in March of 1992, and a civil war will spread there. The civil war is going to be the Bosnian Serbs, which were about 30% of the population, refusing to live in a Muslim dominated state, and will begin military operations assisted by Serbia and the Yugoslav Federal Army. And then the Bosnian major city of Sarajevo will come under attack. And it's at this point that ethnic cleansing will start to take place. So we've talked about genocide, but the term really, as we're moving, closer to current times, would be ethnic cleansing. Bosnian Serbs are going to try to liquidate or remove Muslims by shelling cities, confiscating or destroying of houses, gang rape, expulsion, and murder. And several 100,000 Bosnians are going to be killed in the early 90s. And it's at this point that we're going to get what are known as the Dayton Agreements, because they take place in Dayton, Ohio in 1995. These agreements are going to set forth to divide Bosnia between the Muslims and the Serbs, and the Bosnian Serb aspirations to join a greater Serbia, frustrated by United States and other NATO troops that will be sent in to enforce the Dayton Agreements, and that's going to lead us into the Kosovo crisis of 1999. Milosevic had attempted to ethnically cleanse Kosovo, province of Serbia, of ethnic Albanians who were Muslim, and so President Clinton is here, so we're very close to our time period. He's the president of the United States, and so NATO, led by the United States, is going to bomb Serbia in order to stop the ethnic cleansing. So our troops never marched on the ground. It was all air raids. But this is where we get to a point in history now where there start to be standards of behavior. And Milosevic, for trying to ethnically cleanse Kosovo, is going to be removed from power in 2000 and placed under international charges for war crimes, so just kind of like those Nuremberg trials. And so while he's awaiting his trial, he's supposedly got 1,500 witnesses that are going to say he did nothing wrong. He's going to die in prison before he was tried, and there are some that would say that he was killed in prison, but either way, he dies before he can be charged and, either convicted or found innocent. And then Montenegro is going to vote for its independence in 2006, thus eliminating the last vestige of Yugoslavia. So now we need to turn our attention to nationalism in Western Europe. The unification of Germany in 1990. German unity is going to change the face of European politics, and Germany will now become an economic powerhouse. The Aussies, or the East Germans, had come to feel like second-class citizens in the face of economic difficulties. Remember, they had been held down as in the Eastern Bloc and not given the chance to accept the money or the influence of Westerners or of the United States. But so meanwhile, the Westies, or West Germans, are going to begin to resent the years of heavy taxation to try to help rebuild this lagging East. British resistance to the EU in the late 1980s that we're going to talk about here in 10.4. Although they joined it, they did not take part in the European Monetary Union, or EMU, and accept the euro as its currency. And so we'll see that the British and French are going to have some resistance here to policies in the 1990s, 1980s. French are going to resist NATO in the 1960s and fear American dominance in European politics. We're going to see some terrorist organizations such as the Irish Republican Army start to terrorize English cities, demanding that Northern Ireland be returned to Ireland, so very nationalistic there. ETA in the Basque region of Spain is going to use terrorism in its attempt for independence, and so we start to see this struggle of nationalism and what your identity is really hinder Western Europe. Xenophobia, or anti-immigration policies, are going to become a big deal at this point. And Europe has never really had this melting pot view like we have had, and so xenophobia, or this fear of outsiders, in what a program or a term that becomes known as guest workers, is going to become a major source of tension among right-wing nationalists. North African immigrants are in France, Turkish immigrants in Germany and Austria, and so there's this big push to stop immigration or to not allow these others or outsiders in. In France, Jean-Marie Le Pen was the most outspoken opponent of both immigration and French integration into the European Union. In Austria, Jörg Eder is going to lead the right-wing Austrian Freedom Party that was staunchly opposed to immigration. And his party's ascension to the ruling coalition government in 2000 resulted in the EU demanding that he step down. And so we're going to see that Western Europe and Eastern Europe struggling with the ideal of nationalism and what that means for them. And that's going to turn our attention then towards economic recovery and the struggle for European unity, 1945 to 2001, Unit 10.4. So, the post-war political and economic framework. I'm going to start with the Bretton Woods Conference in 1944, and it is going to lay the foundations for modern international monetary system, and really tackle what were the economic problems before World War II. Let's set out to fix these globally. This is where we're going to get the General Agreements or Tariff and Trade, which is also known as GATT, which sought to stimulate international trade by lowering tariffs and other trade restrictions. It's a treaty, so not an organization, but a signing of a treaty that says we need to lower these tariffs between countries so we can improve trade and strengthen our global economy. By the 1990s, there'll be over 100 countries who will have signed this treaty or participate in this treaty. And it will last from 1948 to 1994, where it will be then replaced by the WTO, which is an organization, the World Trade Organization. It replaces the GATT in 1994. We saw that during the wars that there was this devaluing of money, just like Germany did, where people started to produce more and more money that wasn't based on the gold standard. So between 1958 and 1971, the value of the national currencies will begin to be based on gold and the U.S. dollar. Again, after 1971, however, that's where we get the fluctuating currencies like we have now, because this is the year that the United States leaves the gold standard, so we can deal with some of our own debt problems and start printing more money. But we will see that this is why you get like one day the how many pesos equal a dollar, that kind of thing, so fluctuating money after 1971. And then we're going to get the International Monetary Fund, or IMF, which is designed to provide short-term loans to struggling countries to prevent economic crisis and anarchy, and it was instrumental in the post-war economic boom. Along with this, we'll get the World Bank, which provided long-term loans to countries for economic growth, and both of these are centered in Washington, D.C. So we start to see the United States become the center of this global monetary institution. So the center of world economy is now shifting to the United States, much different than it had been before we went into World War I. And so then we get the United Nations, which was actually a name suggested by our president, FDR, in 1945. It will be created. Remember, this was our desire to make an organization that provided collective security, that would deal with things hopefully more confidently and better than the League had. The UN's framework had been agreed to during World War II by the Allies at the Yalta Conference in February of 1945, and it includes a Security Council which consists of 12 nations, including 5 permanent members or nations that had the authority to actively maintain peace throughout the world. And so these permanent members were the victors in World War II, the United States, the USSR, Britain, France, and China, and they hold veto power, and all 5 of these permanent members, their votes must be unanimous for anything to be carried out. And then the other part of the United Nations is the General Assembly, which includes virtually every other country in the world, and it has the power to advise, but cannot enforce its recommendations. There's 192 plus nations now included in that General Assembly, and the UN is headquartered in New York. So again, the United States being central to these global economic recovery and unity issues. And that's going to bring us back to Western Europe and their political and economic recovery after World War II. And so significant economic hardship is taking place in Western Europe in the aftermath of World War II. Scarcity of food, runaway inflation, black markets are going to plague the economy. A number of Europe's important cities lay destroyed or damaged. Many people believed Europe was finished. Recovery from such a cataclysm seemed almost unthinkable. And our suffering was worse in Germany, where the Allies had destroyed much of the country to defeat Hitler. If you think how the British debt after World War II was 300% of its GDP, or gross domestic product. And I just read somewhere recently that they did not get this paid off until 2004. Their debt from World War II, our highest, has been 109% borrowed against our GDP, and that was in 1946 after World War II. I think we're estimated to be at 80% by 2019, so getting close to where we were after World War II, after the borrowing and stimulus of money for our economy under Obama. But just to kind of give you the debt and the economic hardship was very real in Europe at this time. And then there's also going to be some political restructuring. Christian Democrats are going to emerge as a dominant political movement in several countries. They saw a common Christian and European heritage, and they're going to begin to reject authoritarianism and narrow nationalism and had faith in democracy and cooperation. Catholic parties were also progressive in nature. At this time, and socialist and communist parties emerged with increased power and prestige, especially in France and Italy. And we're going to see the push for social change and economic reform with considerable success. And our result here will be social reform and political transformation created the foundations for a great European Renaissance. So kind of coming full circle as we began the year with the Renaissance and now another rebirth in Europe. All right, so now we're going to run through the countries and the politics really quickly. So Italy, after Mussolini, the Italians, and in his oppressive 20-year rule, the Italians are going to abolish the monarchy, Emmanuel, mainly because they're going to look at him and go, how'd you let this Mussolini guy in? And the Christian Democrats are going to gain control in 1946. They're going to be led by Alcide de Gasperi. He had been like kind of a Vatican librarian during the fascist years here in Italy, but now we're going to see him rise up here. And so he's going to be a ceremonial president, though, because what is supreme in Italy is going to be the legislature. We're going to see at this time socialist influence. Social benefits are going to come to equal a large part of the average worker's wages, and so we'll see, the Christian Democrats being very similar to the kind of promoting the welfare of everyone and all of these things. And so we're going to see this as we travel through countries. So next we're going to talk about France. So in France, General Charles de Gaulle, who's on the right here, who was our inspiring wartime leader of the Free French, is going to reestablish the free and democratic Fourth Republic, 1946 to 1958. So we've gone through so many republics in France now, up to the fourth. His presidency, too, is going to be very ceremonial, just like Italy's, while the real power is laying with the legislature. And he's actually going to resign in 1946 because he wants to be a stronger leader. But it's at this time that we're going to see the right crumble here for, kind of reparations for what had happened during this wartime period. And we're going to see the left begin to take power. And the Catholic Party in France, like the Christian Democrats, are going to seek social justice and provide some of the best post-war leaders. Example is Robert Schuman, who we'll talk about in just a little bit. But socialist influence was significant, and some industries are even going to be nationalized by the government in France at this time. We are going to see, however, because we are now in the Fifth Republic of France, that the fourth is going to fall because it had tried to maintain the French colonial empire and those actions like we saw in Algeria. And in 1958, we're going to see the development of the Fifth Republic, and it's, as it says, 1958 to present. And it is going to give the president, as the Fourth Republic falls, some emergency powers. So Charles de Gaulle is going to step back on the scene in 1958. So because of this, being able to have more power. And so Great Britain is going to follow a similar path to France. Remember, Churchill is out, and we have Clement Attlee. From 1945 to 1951. He's from the Socialist Labor Party, and he's its leader. He had defeated Winston Churchill and the Conservatives in 1945. And Attlee is going to move toward the establishment of a welfare state. And the reason that Churchill had lost the election is because he was against all of these things. And we're going to see under Attlee that many industries are going to be nationalized. The government's going to provide each citizen with free medical service, and they're going to tax the middle and upper classes more heavily to help pay for these things. So we're going to see social welfare expanded under Attlee and the Socialist Labor Party. In the Federal Republic of Germany, we are going to see West Germany. 1949, Konrad Adenauer, who I've talked about just a little bit, who was an anti-Nazi during the war period and very patriarchal. He wants to be, in power. He's going to begin a long, highly successful democratic rule. And he wants to reform Germany to its glory. He wants to bring it back, to a symbol of goodness and glory and back into the European Community. And so he's going to be concerned with morality and ethics and what is right to do. And we're going to see Christian Democrats become West Germany's majority party for a generation. And this is going to really lead us. We have all of these politics going, but all of these social welfare kind of systems, we're going to see the economic miracle or the unprecedented economic growth in European history up until the 1960s. And by 1963, Western Europe will produce more than 2.5 times more than before the war. And so we need to look at the causes of that. So causes of the European economy really growing and expanding and having economic progress, especially with all those people that had counted Europe out. A, Marshall Plan. Remember the aid from the United States that had helped Western European begin recovery in 1947. B, the Korean War in 1950 is going to stimulate economic activity. And economic growth is going to become a basic objective of all Western European governments. And the governments are going to attempt that Keynesian economics that we've talked about to stimulate their economies, or that priming the pump of pouring all of this money in to put money back in your people's hands so they can spend it. So governments are going to be willing to use that Keynesian deficit spending in order to make more resources available for the people. Germany and France will be especially successful and influential with this policy of economic growth. And in most countries, many workers are going to be willing to work hard for low wages, thus benefiting expanding industries. We're going to see an increase in the demand for consumer goods, and many economic barriers are going to be eliminated and large unified market emerge, or the common market. And we're going to see that Germany's economic recovery is going to be led by Finance Minister Ludwig Erhard. He's going to combine a free market economy and an extensive social welfare network inherited from the Nazi era into what will become known as a mixed economy. And by the late 1950s, West Germany will have strong economy, full employment, and a strong currency and stable prices. And so France is going to combine flexible planning and a mixed state, so a mixed economy as well, and private economy to achieve the most rapid economic development in French history. Jean Monnet is going to lead the economic recovery, and he was an economic pragmatist and architect of European unity. And France is going to use the Marshall Plan aid and the nationalized banks to funnel money into key industries, several of which were state-owned. Examples of nationalized industries are going to include large banks, insurance companies, public utilities, coal mines, and the Renault Auto Company. And so the creation of the welfare state, our Western European countries are going to seek to provide universal services to all of their people, so not just the poor, but to everyone, things such as unemployment, providing jobs, disability insurance, social security for the elderly, free or subsidized health care, redistribution of wealth and income by placing high taxes on wealthier citizens. And the welfare state would be universal and not just aimed at the poor and unemployed, which has largely been the case before World War I. And so this is going to significantly reduce class tensions that existed in Europe for centuries, because it's going to be like we're all in this together. The Christian Democrats in West Germany, France, and Italy played a key role in shaping the welfare state. Socialists and communists communists, particularly in France and Italy, are going to demand egalitarianism as well as social services. And as long as the European economy in Western and Central Europe continued to grow in the 1950s and 1960s, governments could more or less meet the expenses, the burdening expenses of the welfare state. And Britain is going to become our model for the welfare state in a mixed economy under the Socialist Labour Party and Prime Minister Clement Attlee. And all these things we've talked about in England, and you can kind of read through there, these bullet points there, as we've talked about this already. We are going to see, however, there will be a push back at we've always seen through European history that when the pendulum swings all the way to one side, it usually harkens back. And with the economic downturn and high inflation in the 1970s, we're going to see governments experiencing larger deficits and increased national debts, and pressure from the conservatives then to lower taxes. And the conservatives in the 1970s are going to argue that the welfare state had become excessive while high taxation was stunning economic growth. And we'll see in the 1970s and the pendulum swing back the other way, and the welfare state will be trimmed throughout Europe. In some countries, such as Britain, led by conservative Margaret Thatcher that we've talked about, government began privatizing industries that had been state-owned and restricting labor strikes. And so we're going to come back to the guest workers we just talked about. Everything kind of comes full circle in this ending lecture. The dramatic increase in the economy coupled with a low birth rate, because we had the baby boom right after, but then we're going to see a decrease in birth rate, meant that there weren't enough workers available to meet the demands of the economy. And so we're going to see significant numbers of immigrants come in during this time period. And you could read through all of the numbers here. I won't stop for those. But eventually, as we talked about, nationalists in the receiving countries became troubled with how the guest workers seem to be affecting the culture and economy, and we're going to see pressures mounting on some governments to put restrictions on immigration due to this. All right, so now we're going to get into our big topic, European unity. We're going to see that Europe's unity is most successful economically, but they're going to try and are still trying to politically unify, but most successful is going to be in the policy of economics. So the Council of Europe is going to be created in 1948, and European Federalists hope the Council will quickly evolve into a true European Parliament with sovereign rights. So meaning that they would make decisions for the whole, but we're going to see that this does not happen because Britain, with its empire and its special relationship with the United States, was opposed to giving any real political power or sovereignty to the council. And in 1958, we'll see what does come out of this, however, is the Court of Human Rights. European Court of Human Rights will come out of it, so like a panel that will you need to be following these basic human tenets. And then in 1948, Belgium, the Netherlands and Luxembourg are going to form a customs union, so they're going to say that there are no tariffs between them. And then there will be the European Coal and Steel Community. So what those three little countries had done in 1948, they're like, let's do this bigger. It's going to be created via the Schuman Plan. So it was largely organized by the French statesman Jean Monnet and Foreign Minister Robert Schuman. And this proposed an international organization to control and integrate European steel and coal production. And so it's going to start first with the countries of West Germany, Italy, Belgium, the Netherlands, and Luxembourg are going to accept the plan in 1952, and the plan says that there will be no tariffs or no quotas on steel and coal between these countries, that there will be free trade between them. Britain, again, is going to refuse to enter since it had a significant interest in its Commonwealth and its close trade relationship with the United States. But the ECSC's immediate economic goal was to have a single competitive market without national tariffs or quotas. And so the those first countries, by 1958, coal and steel will move freely among these 6 nations of the European coal and steel community. And the far-reaching political goal of this group is to bind the 6 member nations so closely together economically that war among them would become unthinkable and virtually impossible. And so we're going to see much more success with economic unity in Europe than anything else at this time. And so these same 6 are going to then have the European Economic Community, the EEC, give us the Treaty of Rome in 1957, which created the European Economic Community, EEC, or for shorthand, the Common Market. The same six nations that we just talked about in the European Coal and Steel Community are those that started it, and the first goal of this treaty is the gradual reduction of all tariffs, so not just steel and coal, among the six in order to create a single market almost as large as the United States. And so then some of their other goals are free movement of capital and labor across borders, common economic policies and institutions, the reduction of tariffs and regional specialization, so countries are going to focus on producing goods where they had a comparative advantage. And the EEC is going to encourage hopes of a political and economic union because it was working. However, the idea for the union will be frustrated in the 1960s by the resurgence of some more traditional nationalism. And so we see initially they're coming together, but then nationalism is going to rear its ugly head, and France is actually going to step back from European unity because of the bitter colonial war in Algeria, resulting in the election in 1958 of General Charles de Gaulle, who established the Fifth French Republic and led as president until 1969 that we've talked about, was actually against this union. And so he's going to withdraw France from what he saw as a U.S.-controlled NATO and develop France's own nuclear weapons program. And de Gaulle will twice veto the application of pro-American Britain into the European Union because he didn't like the special relationship that Britain and the United States had. And so Britain will not enter until 1973. And so now we're going to see the move towards the European Union, or EU, that would go into effect in 1992. And so the common market is going to be renamed the European Union. And German Chancellor Kohl and French President Mitterrand will seek to extend the EU to include a single European currency and a common defense and foreign policy. The British Prime Minister Margaret Thatcher is actually going to lead Britain's opposition to the EU until she resigned in November of 1990, and she will be replaced by a conservative successor, John Major, who urged a limited federalism. And at this time, we're going to get the Maastricht Treaty of 1991. And this is going to promise the most radical revision of the EC since its beginning, and that is the creation of a single form of money, or the euro. Will become the single currency of the EU in 2002, integrating the currency of 12 Western and Central European nations. The integration of currency was organized by the European Monetary Union, or EMU. Britain and Denmark, however, are going to refuse to join the EMU, preferring to maintain the sovereignty of its currency, the pound. We will see that 16 countries, however, do enter into what is known as the Eurozone. And by 1995, the EU will have 15 members: Germany, France, Italy, Netherlands, Belgium, Luxembourg, the UK, Ireland, Spain, Portugal, Greece, Austria, and Finland. And then in 2005, the EU is going to add 10 new countries. And these 10 are Cyprus, the Czech Republic, Estonia, Hungary, Latvia, Lithuania, Malta, Poland, Slovakia, and Slovenia. And in 2007, 2 new states are slated to enter: Romania and Bulgaria. And the European Community, or EC, was renamed to the European Union in 1996. And so this is proceeding towards what I was mentioning earlier, like a United States of Europe. If this works, if this continues, could there be one United States of Europe? There are 3 official candidates, countries that want in right now: Turkey, Croatia, and Macedonia. But there are things called the Copenhagen criteria that you have to be accepted. You have to have stable currency. You have to respect human rights. You have to have a working market economy. So Switzerland has also applied, but Norway has actually rejected membership. And what almost came out of this, so I think that, like I said, they are much better economically unified than politically, but this could lead us towards political unification, because in 2005, a European constitution was promoted. However, it will be denied because the votes must be unanimous between the countries, and it was rejected by France and the Netherlands. And so if this is something maybe that is still in the works, to have a unified Europe at some time, but we're going to turn away from that right now and come back to some not unity but crises, economic crises of the 1970s. Okay, so economic crises of the 1970s isn't just going to hit Europe or the United States, but the whole world. U.S. President Richard Nixon will take the United States off the gold standard in 1971, which we briefly talked about before. But why is there's more dollars being produced than there are gold? We've sent a lot of money with the Marshall Plan, and then like buying things in Europe, and a lot of dollars floating around. And so there's a question of the value of the dollar. And so Nixon's going to take us off the gold standard, and this will effectively end the Bretton Woods system that we talked about of international currency stabilization, and fixed rates of exchange will be abandoned. And so this is going to devalue the dollar and give us those fluctuating rates that we still have today. So great uncertainty is going to replace post-war predictability in international trade and finance. And then we're going to get another issue, which is going to be the energy crisis coming next. So the post-war economic boom was fueled by cheap oil. All of this improvement had happened because energy was really, really cheap, especially in Western Europe. I think in 1950 it was $2.49 a barrel of oil, but then with inflation that'd make it about $17.75 now. And so today it's $52 a barrel of oil. And so you can see how much more expensive the energy gets. And so we're going to get this organization in 1973 called OPEC, or the Organization of Petroleum Exporting Countries, and it's going to try to control oil and prices, but it's going to start to use its power as a political tool, because it is going to dramatically increase oil prices and Europe and the United States in retaliation for their support of Israel in the Yom Kippur War against Egypt and Syria. And so they're going to use it as a tool to punish for political things by raising the price. They'll also give a second price increase in 1979 during the Iranian Revolution that will hurt this modest progress since 1976. So this price revolution in energy, coupled with the upheaval in the international monetary system, or going off the gold standard, is going to plunge the world into its worst economic decline since the Great Depression of the 1930s. So we talked about inflation a lot. This is where we're going to get a time period called stagflation that's going to hit in the mid-1970s. And this is a combination of increased prices and increased unemployment. Inflation with increased unemployment made this crisis unique. Usually inflation and unemployment have an inverse relationship. And so stagflation is going to hit in 1970s, and the economy is never going to be any worse. It's almost worse than in the Great Depression. And debts and deficits are going to pile up quickly in the 1970s and 1980s. And so there's going to be a lot of social consequences of this 1970s economic crisis. This first consequences we're going to see, and we've already talked about, is it created a condition for the collapse of communism in the late 1980s. The pessimism is going to be replaced with optimism in society in general. So when we were just talking about that renaissance and like, woohoo, rebirth, it's going to be like, oh, crap. However, these welfare states that we just followed, created in the post-war era, are going to prevent mass suffering and degradation that had been reminiscent of the Great Depression in the 1930s. And so those are going to help. But total government spending in most countries is going to rise during the 1970s and 1980s. And we're going to see a conservative resurgence in the late 1970s and early 1980s that result from economic frustrations. So by the 1970s, powerful reaction against increased government's role is going to result in austerity measures or economic measures to slow the growth of public spending and the welfare state. And this is where we're going to get leaders like Reagan and Thatcher and Mitterrand that we've talked about. And so Prime Minister Margaret Thatcher, 1979 to 1990 of Great Britain, is going to have certain government-controlled industries now privatized. She's going to reduce government spending. She's going to encourage the working class and lower middle class renters in state-controlling housing units to purchase their own apartments at very low prices. We're going to see a whole new class of property owners emerge. And then France in the early 1980s is going to attempt to increase government's role in the economy, but that is going to ultimately fail. So Francois Mitterrand, who is a socialist, leads his Socialist Party and Communist allies in launching a vast program of nationalization. So he goes back the other way in public investment designed to spin France out of economic stagnation that Keynesian approach of pumping money in. But by 1983, the policy had failed, and Mitterrand is also going to have to then, like Thatcher, be forced to impose a wide variety of austerity measures for the remainder of the decade. In 1993, frustrated French voters gave coalition of conservatives and moderates overwhelming victory, thus rejecting 14 years of socialist rule. And this is leading us up to European society after World War II. Okay, so now European society after World War II. This is our last section and we are done. Middle Ages all the way to modern times. So science and technology. For the first time in history, pure theoretical science and practical technology effectively joined together on a massive scale during World War II, which became applied science. This is the merging of technology in science. We're going to see the development of the radar to detect enemy aircraft, jets, electronic computers, the Manhattan Project, the development of the atomic bomb. So big science is going to become a new model for science after World War II. We're going to see we're going to start to spend all kinds of money on science. We're going to combine theoretical science with sophisticated engineering and huge organization, massive funding, lots of money, science, science, science. The U.S. is going to emerge as a leader in big science after World War II, and science will not demobilize after World War II in either the U.S. or USSR, and large portions of all post-war scientific research went for defense, about 25% of the funding for defense. And so here we are back at the space race, which we've already mentioned before. Part of the Cold War competition to achieve technological superiority is a quintessential example of big science at work. If you remember, in 1957, the USSR had launched the Sputnik, an orbiting satellite, using long-range rockets, which really freaked us out. So us fearful that Soviets could now launch a nuclear missile into space and then down to the United States is going to result in the development of ICBMs, or intercontinental ballistic missiles. And so the U.S. will counter with the creation of NASA and vastly increase educational funding for science. So science. So then in 1961, the Soviets will send the world's first cosmonaut. We call them astronauts. They call them cosmonauts. Yuri Gagarin into orbit, which is going to prompt a response from our United States president at the time, JFK. And so JFK will respond by increasing funds for space, and in 1969 the U.S. Apollo program will put the first man on the moon, and 4 more landings will be followed by 1972. This is going to create what is known as the brain drain, because the United States at this time is science is going to begin attracting many of Europe's best scientists during the 1950s and 1960s, and it's seen as the American challenge because some Europeans feared that Europe was falling behind the United States in science, technology, and most dynamic industrial sectors of the late 20th century because we're recruiting everyone to come over here. I think this still this is a pretty big thing today, this brain drain, although I think a lot more now are getting educated here than going back home. But massive growth of the scientific community is going to happen at this time. 4 times as many scientists in Europe and North America in 1975 as in 1945. And we're going to see highly specialized modern scientists and technologists work as members of a team, which completely changed work and lifestyle of modern scientists. And so we're also going to see change in class structure and social reform here. We're going to see the rise of the middle class being largely the result of the increased access to higher education. This time period can also be called leveling out, I believe is what your textbook calls it. As European society became more mobile and democratic, the new middle class became highly skilled and educated and was more open, democratic, and less secure than the old proportioned middle class. Changes in the structure of the middle class were influential in the trend towards a less rigorous class structure. The causes for change: rapid industrialization and technological expansion. The old middle class lost control of money. Many family-owned businesses after World War II. Top managers and ranking civil servants represented the model for the new middle class, and it's passed on opportunity for advanced education to their children. And we're also then going to see the structure of the lower classes is also going to change. And so we're going to see that the lower class, we're going to see that continue. Millions of rural workers continue to move more to cities or urbanization. Industrial working class ceased to expand while job opportunities for white-collar and service employers grew rapidly. We're going to see that European governments reduce, like we talked about earlier, a lot of this is just review, reduce class tensions by further expanding the welfare state because it's like we're all in it together. And this is going to bring us into consumerism. And so here's also where you get that leveling. Consumerism is going to work to level Western society, and it was sparked by rising standard of living, giving more people disposable income, so they have more money to spend. The European automobile industry is going to expand phenomenally. There's the Volkswagen. We're going to see the gadget revolution. Europeans begin buying washing machines, vacuum cleaners, refrigerators, dishwashers, radios, TVs, and stereos. And the purchase of goods is often done by greatly by installment, or example like credit cards, so done on credit so people can afford to get things. We're going to see that the increased social welfare that we've talked about is going to result in more disposable income and less need to save for old age, because why do you need to save for old age if your government is going to take care of you? And so we'll see that with more disposable income just adds to that consumerism. We're also going to see leisure and recreation become major industries as workers worked fewer hours, so they have more time for leisure stuff. So like soccer matches, horse races, movies, TV, commercialized hobbies, increase in attendance in cultural events, concerts, and expositions, and probably the biggie here, travel industry expanded most dramatically. Before World War II, travel for pleasure or relaxation was largely just aristocratic, but now you're going to see that mandated paid vacations are going to, in most countries, allow people then to travel and by airplane. So now we're going to see the youth movement and counterculture. So the counterculture is a rebellion against parents, authority figures, and status quo. So we're going to see the baby boom after World War II develop distinctive and international youth culture. Many youths were raised in this new economic prosperity and were more democratic in views of class structure. They're in their teens right now, these baby boomers, and today they'd be about in their 60s, but we're going to see that this creates for the first time, a distinct youth market, and this new generation of teens and those in their 20s are influenced by the revival of leftist thought, creating this very new and distinct counterculture, which the youth in America are going to take the lead of. And some youth are going to rebel against conformity and what they would consider the boredom of middle-class suburbs, having been born into, all of this money and this economic prosperity, and they're going to want to be different. And we're going to see that rock music is going to start to help to tie this counterculture together. The Beatles band, British rock band, is going to become one of the biggest pop groups in music history, and really tie this counterculture together. So rock and roll in the United States and in Britain. With this, there's going to be increased sexual behavior among many young people during the 1960s and 1970s. The age of the first sexual experience will reduce significantly, and there'll be a growing tendency for the first time of young unmarried people to live together on a semi-permanent basis with little thought of getting married or having children. Causes for this emergence of international youth culture in the 1960s is going to be the mass communication, and youth travel is going to link countries and continents together. Remember, these baby boomers are a huge part of the population, and this meant that the youth became unusually large part for the first time and exercise exceptional influence on society as a whole. Post-war prosperity and greater equality are going to give youth more purchasing power than ever before. Youth is going to set mass trends and fads in everything from music to chemical stimulants because they have money to spend. Common patterns of consumption and behavior fostered generational loyalty, and good jobs are going to be readily available to this youth. This high demand for workers meant youth had little need to fear punishment from straight-laced employers for unconventional behavior. And so, they're not so worried because they're so high in demand that, I'll have my long hair, I'll do my drugs. They're not worried about, where in other terms, if there wasn't a high demand, they could be more stringent. Like, no, you need to cut your hair. No, maybe don't do those drugs. So we're going to start to see the youth not listening to the older generation. They're kind of taking everything for granted, and then when they do see inequality, they think it's unfair, and they're going to want to do things to oppose or fix what they would consider these wrongs. And so we're going to start to see these student revolts in the late 1960s, and the cause of this, one huge is the opposition to the United States war in Vietnam is going to trigger revolutionary ferment among youth. They're going to be influenced by Marxist current in French universities after 1945 and New Left thinking in the United States. And they believe that the older generation in the United States was fighting a moral and imperialistic war against Vietnam, and students in Western Europe are going to share the United States youth's rejection of materialism and belief that post-war society was repressive and flawed. And so we're going to start to see this is also compounded by problems in higher education. Classes are going to become overcrowded. There's going to be little contact with professors. And competition for grades will become intense, and demand for even more practical areas of study to qualify for high-paying jobs after college. Some students were concerned about the growth of the narrowly trained experts or technocrats who would serve the establishment while ignoring the working class. And so all of these things compounded with kind of the beliefs in this counterculture is going to lead to the French student revolt in 1968. And 1968 is really one of those big years. Again, Martin Luther King is going to be shot that year. Bobby Kennedy is going to be shot that year. And we're going to see students in France lead a revolt in this year. And so in 1968, the students are going to, with some of the younger faculty members, are going to take over the university after a radical student is expelled. And this is going to lead to violent clashes with the police. We're going to have lots of students killed, hundreds injured, because they do what great French do, and they put up all of these little barricades when the police get there. Most of these students who are revolting are demanding changes in curriculum and a real voice in running the university. They're like, we don't want to listen to you old people. We know what needs to be changed. And the students are going to appeal to the industrial workers for help. In May of 1968, there will be a spontaneous general strike of the workers that spread across France to support the students. And to many, it seemed that this new French Fifth Republic is going to collapse. And so de Gaulle will call on his troops and call for new elections, which he will win decisively. And then he is going to turn to the middle class and conservatives to counter these workers and students. And then simultaneously, he's going to raise wages for the workers, so they are going to abandon the students, and the mini revolution will collapse. But for much of the older generation in Western Europe, the student revolution of 1968 signaled the end of illusions, like that everything is great and maybe there is some negative stuff out there, and the end of an era. And so now we're going to get to our last part here with women. And so now women, a review here. We have gone from our early women's rights advocates, Olympe de Gouges and Mary Wollstonecraft during the French Revolution, that had demanded equality for women based on the Declaration of Rights of Man and Citizen. Then we saw in the late 19th and early 20th century, Millicent Garrett Fawcett and Emmeline Pankhurst were important figures in the British suffrage movement, or the right to vote. And then women are going to first receive the right to vote in Finland and Norway in 1906, and in Britain, Germany, and the Soviet Union after World War I. And then women we saw relegated to the home in fascist Italy and Nazi Germany, and women finally getting suffrage in Italy and France after World War II because of their efforts in the war, and then Switzerland being one of the last to provide suffrage in 1980. But we're going to see, even with the suffrage movement being successful, women are still going to want more than just the right to vote, and this is going to continue in our women's right movement. And so in the post-war era, we're going to see that women are going to continue, as we have seen, to marry earlier. European culture once again emphasized the domestic role women should play in the home. The typical woman in Europe, United States, and Canada had children quickly after marrying, but now we have an average of only 2 children per family, which is going to allow motherhood to occupy a much smaller portion of a woman's life than at the turn of the century, because you're not having like 10 kids you got to put out there. We're going to see also the use of birth control with oral contraceptives and intrauterine devices radically change the role of women, as they are no longer a slave to their biology. And then we will get into then with women not being trapped at home as much and going out to get income, women in the workplace. So in the 20th century, especially after World War II, opportunities for women of modest means to earn cash income at home practically disappeared, as we're having less children, so they're going to have to step out. So there'll be a sharp increase across Europe and North America in the number of married women who became full-time and part-time wage earners outside the home. And the rising employment of married women became a powerful force in the drive for women's equality and emancipation. And rising employment for married women will become a big factor in this decline of the birth rate. And so we're going to have two really big names in the middle of the 20th century in women's rights movement. The first is Simone de Beauvoir, and she gives us the book The Second Sex in 1949, and she follows a lot of existentialist ideas. Her lover's for art, who remembers existentialism and believes in action. So following a lot of his ideas, she's going to argue that women were in essence free, but had almost always been trapped by particularly inflexible and limiting conditions or by man. And that they are being denied positions of authority, and only by courageous action, there's that existentialism there, and self-assertive creativity could women become free and escape the role of the inferior other that men had placed us in. And she says that being placed in the other category is just like a race or class or religion. Sex is also being placed in the other category, and that you need to make a courageous action to go against this stereotype of being the other sex. And she inspired a future generation of women's rights intellectuals, like our second name here, Betty Friedan, who's actually an American. So she gives us the work The Feminine Mystique in 1963, and she was highly influenced by de Beauvoir's ideas on how middle-class women were trapped in their domestic roles. And she's going to argue that women were expected to conform to a false, infantile pattern of femininity, and like what women are expected to be, and live for their husbands and children. And she's going to be responsible then for founding the National Organization for Women, which still exists, NOW is the acronym, which is going to inspire many European groups. And so then our goal of women's rights movements that have been suffrage, where we left off, is now going to be new statutes in the workplace or new laws against discrimination. They're going to demand equal pay for equal work. So if a woman's doing the same job as a man, she should be paid the same, and maternity leave and affordable daycare. This is going to lead to gender and family questions. Women want the right to divorce. In some Catholic countries, they're still not allowed to. They want legalized abortion. They want to protect the needs of single parents, usually women, and protection from rape and physical violence. And in almost every country, the effort to legalize abortion is going to inspire the creation of an effective women's movement, because women want to have biological freedom. And so feminism, in the 1970s, women played a significant role in other reform movements such as environmentalism, gay rights, and poverty in developing countries. And some feminists lashed out at what they considered to be a male-dominated culture that emphasized ladylike behavior in women. And they're going to start to criticize beauty pageants, condemn male chauvinism, and even burn bras to what they saw as a cultural oppression of women. And that leads us into our very last topic, religion. Okay, so in 1950 we had Pope Pius XII, who was serving as Pope during World War II, and actually he's going to get a lot of criticism for not standing up to Hitler or doing anything with the Jews and the Holocaust, but he is important to us right here because he gives us the only new Catholic dogma of the 20th century, which is called the Assumption, which says that the Virgin Mary was literally transported up to heaven, so didn't have a natural death, but physically transported up to heaven. But then Pope Pius XII is going to die in 1959. We're going to get Pope John XIII. He is 77 years old when he assumes the title of Pope, and he will only serve for 4 years. But he's one of the most innovative popes because he is going to give us the Second Vatican Council. It's the first one since 1870. Sometimes you'll hear it called Vatican II. But this is the most important council of the Catholic Church since the Council of Trent, all the way back with the Reformation in the mid-16th century. So, all the way back at the beginning of the class, this is the most important one. And why? It's because it's going to assert the Catholic Church. If you're Catholic, you might not have even understood the way the Catholic Church was run before the Second Vatican Council. It's going to allow for the first time the use of the vernacular in the Catholic liturgy so that your Mass can be given in your language instead of Latin. This is huge because it's always been given in Latin. Scripture is going to be declared to be the foundation of the Church. It's going to reaffirm the celibacy of the priests and nuns, but it's going to make the rules less harsh on what they wear. It's going to reaffirm its stance against birth control. It is going to say that the Pope has collectivity, which means that he shares power, that he needs to talk and communicate or collectivize with the higher ups in the church. It is going to absolve the Jews of deicide. So this in the Latin mass, it had been said, that the Jews were responsible for killing Jesus, and so you can see how that was leading to anti-Semitism. So it's going to absolve the Jews of this. It's going to reaffirm that Scripture was the foundation of the church, and declare that although the Catholic Church was the one true church, other Christian groups who shared a belief in Christ were to be respected. So all of these very important things, and then we're going to see that by the 21st century, Europe had continued to display a much more strong secular than religious streak. A poll in 2005 is going to show that only 21% of Europeans believe religion is very important, compared to 59% in the United States. We're a much more religious nation than in Europe. A 2004 Gallup poll is going to find that only 15% of Europeans attend church regularly, compared to 44% of Americans, although these figures vary from country to country. And countries where Catholicism is dominant have significantly higher attendance, except for France. And so that is the sum up, guys. That is all of European history. Thanks for hanging in there. This is the very last of it, and I will see you back in class.